Hello, everyone. Welcome back for another episode of Therapy Talks. It's Haley here. And today we have our guest, Tanya Wishlove, joining us to talk about somatic experiencing. We talk about this idea that not everyone experiences trauma the same way. Somatic experiencing offers an opportunity to process and release that pent up energy. Because when two people may experience the same traumatic experience, they may not have the same resulting outcome. What's really great about this episode is we give you an example of a somatic experiencing exercise as me as the mock client. Hope you enjoy. Welcome, Tanya. I'd love for you to take a moment to introduce yourself, your professional background, and your areas of modalities and specialties that you focus in.
Okay, well, thanks for having me, Haley. My name is Tanya Wishlove. I'm in Kelowna. I have a private counseling practice. I've been doing this since 2012, I believe. And I would say my specialty and my preference is working with the body, working with the nervous system to help renegotiate events of overwhelm that happen in our bodies at different points in time. So I have my somatic experiencing practitioner's designation. I did the somatic experiencing training. I've gone on and done post grad trainings after that training, early developmental touch training. I'm currently involved in a 4-year Feldenkrais training program, which is another somatic movement-based practice that goes really well with somatic experiencing. So working with the body and how it helps us renegotiate events that maybe we didn't get to negotiate properly, that's my jam.
Mm-hmm. And so I hear you use a lot the word negotiate. So would you maybe explain or kind of express what that is?
Nice catch, Haley. I use the word negotiate because I don't use the word heal. And the reason that I don't use the word heal is because I've learned from different teachers and practitioners, there's different perspectives about that. And I like to be respectful of people's intentions when they come and do the work. And really what we're doing when we're working with trauma physiology in the nervous system is we are negotiating. There's an experience that happened in the body. If it didn't get a chance to come into completion and resolve, then there's this unprocessed life force energy that needs to be worked with. And we don't come in and dive in and, fix it. We set conditions to see what the most supportive way is for the body to process this. And to me, that feels like a negotiation.
Okay.
Yeah, rather than a demand.
Mm-hmm. So my experience is not in somatic experiencing as like training. I'm more of an EMDR therapist and those
Okay.
sorts of things.
Yeah.
So it would be really wonderful to educate myself and everyone listening what really is somatic experiencing, and when you express this idea of negotiation and these experiences kind of getting stuck and not to completion in the body.
I think perhaps the reason Peter Levine named this modality somatic experiencing is because it's an experience that you're having, and it's challenging to articulate what's actually going on. And I have many clients say, like, can you tell me what this looks like? What does the session look like? What's going to happen? What can I expect? And, I can give some loose ideas, but every system, even though we are made the same, every system's individual based on your history of experience, the capacity of your nervous system, your ancestry. Like, there's so many factors and layers to this. So I'm going to read you what's on the website for the Kelowna training. Is that okay?
Yes, please.
Okay. So this says somatic experiencing is a body-oriented therapeutic model applied in multiple professions for healing trauma and other stress disorders. It's based on a multidisciplinary intersection of physiology, psychology, ethology, biology, neuroscience, indigenous healing practices, and medical biophysics. It's the work of Peter Levine. It releases traumatic shock, which is a key in transforming post-traumatic stress disorder, and wounds of emotional and early developmental attachment trauma. It assesses where people are stuck in a freeze response or a fight or a flight response, and then sets the conditions to help the nervous system complete those responses if they're incomplete. And reintegrate that trauma physiology as life energy, because that's really what it is. It's unprocessed life energy that our body's holding on to. We get to reintegrate it. So we have access to it to engage in our lives in ways that maybe we aren't able to because it's kind of being held. Yeah. So
Okay.
that's the long, convoluted answer to your question.
Okay. So maybe I'll paraphrase and then you can correct me in my understanding, because again, that's not my specialty, but I really am so curious about somatic experiencing. So what I understand, if we were to break this down, is say something awful happens or something that's really hurtful for someone or upsetting or too much too soon or too much of something, right? Happens, whatever we want to call it. We could call it trauma, what we can call a lot of different things. Our nervous system then is designed to keep us safe, and it will produce a very instinctual response called the fight, flight, freeze response. Some of those will happen. And when those responses happen, we're not adequately going through that experience, the traumatic experience, hurtful experience, etc., in its entirety. We almost have that experience stuck with us. So when we practice somatic experiencing, we're allowing ourselves this opportunity to release that energy in some ways.
Haley, that was so beautiful. I'm glad we're recording this so we can listen to that later. That was so well said.
I'm taking a crack at it. I'm like, is this right? Is this my understanding? Because I actually tried to earlier this week, like pull up some YouTube mock sessions and things. And I found so many great exercises that I'm going to start implementing in my practice. But I couldn't actually find like what a session would look like when you spoke to this idea when clients ask, what can I expect? So I'm trying to summarize it as eloquently as possible, what this means or what this looks like.
You did a beautiful job. And, when you said the too much, too fast, too soon, that's really what trauma is. I use the words trauma and overwhelm interchangeably because trauma, Peter Levine talks about trauma not being in the event, it's in the nervous system. And I think that's just it's a perspective, and it might be a misunderstanding more collectively of because people say I had this trauma and that trauma and that trauma. And really the trauma is what's here, not the thing that happened out there. And you said something, I can't remember how you articulated it. But it made me think that, if we do go through something overwhelming and we have the support that we need, and we get to slow down and let our bodies kind of process it, there's likely not going to be leftover processing that needs to be done. If we get to sort of have good co-regulation or good support while we're moving through an experience, whether it's like an acute thing or a more of a long-term thing, chances of experiencing trauma in it are much, much less when we have support through it and a sense of connection to others. So it's not always the case when we go through an overwhelming thing that we're going to need to do some cleanup in the nervous system, but oftentimes because, culturally here in North America, we maybe haven't learned these things in certain parts of our community on how we're actually made to move through these things with the right conditions. Kind of like the animals, let our bodies do what they were made to do. We're used to holding things in and, I'm okay, and then isolating. And, these are all paradigms and practices of coping that we're coming out of. But it's not always the case. Many people go through things and they have good support and they don't experience post-traumatic stress disorder from it. They go through the coherent process and they move on into their lives. Yeah.
And that's why maybe I want to highlight when you said this idea that the trauma isn't what's happening outside of us, outside of our bodies. Trauma is that experience of our body in the way that it's processing or reacting to what's happening outside of us, the external experience. And like when you made this idea, when you say co-regulation, just to kind of break that down for anyone that's listening, it's that idea that we can use supports and relationships around us to help to keep us at a really reasonable flow in our life. And that's why, I always say to people as an example, and I use a car accident because we can all conceptualize that, is say two of us are in the car in the back seat, neither of us are driving, we're both passengers, and we get into a car accident. our experiences of that car accident will be different, even though we were in the same situation. And not, but one of us may walk away with post traumatic stress disorder symptoms or not, or may walk away with a lot of anxiety or dysregulation from that experience. And the other passenger may be okay to regulate in that sense of self. And I'm not saying that there's a hierarchy between these two people and one is better at it or than the other one. It's just our own internal experiences are different, even though we had the same external experience.
That's exactly it. That's exactly it. And it speaks to the thing we talked about before about some people just have greater capacity in their nervous system. Some people may have early developmental trauma or birth trauma or, things holding in their autonomic nervous system that are going to inhibit them from being able to find regulation or reach for the support they need or feel like they have a sense that this is going to be okay. So yeah, that's the piece about it's not the external thing, it's the internal that's going to determine whether or not something is going to be experienced as trauma.
So, in the application of somatic experiencing as a therapeutic modality, is there a lot of curiosity on a person's history, like their experiences, their attachments, their relationships, their childhoods, those sorts of things?
This is where I think every practitioner has a different way of attending to it. And I just had the privilege of being in the midst of some really fantastic practitioners, and we did some talking about this kind of thing. Everybody's intake looks a little bit different depending on how they work. I do tend to take a little bit of a history so that I understand what clients are managing in their nervous system. I'm interested in what someone's birth experience was like, if they have any information about that, if they had any falls, extensive dental work, any surgeries, because all these things are going to give me an idea of, um, yeah, what their nervous system is managing. If there's any anesthetic on board, if they tend to maybe go into more of a fight response or a freeze response, and all that is just it's content, it's information. I hold it loosely because the body is going to show me what's going on. It always does. It's got all the stories. Um, we just set the conditions and it starts to show itself. And then we are navigating because we don't want to dive into the trauma. We are going to be coming in from the edges. We're going to be building the resource or feeding into the resource that's already there, the resilience and the resource that people just inherently have. If they show up for a session, they've got resource and resilience on board. So we want to really be attending to that and then working towards the trauma from that place. So having that historical information is helpful. It's not always necessary. And sometimes I've worked with clients who aren't even able to articulate. We do very little talking when they come in just because of the impact of their experiences and their history. So sometimes it's just not possible to get that information from people. And that's okay because we don't actually need it. It's just kind of helpful for me as a framework sometimes to understand if something's showing up in session, I can have an association to, oh, this might be that thing, but it's actually not super necessary.
Hmm. And so when you say the body will show you, the person will show you, are you actually meaning like body language, any noises, any shifts in the person's posture, those sorts of things?
Yeah, it's literally those things. It's facial expressions, it's posture. There can be little movements, pupil dilation, eye movement, skin flushing, pulse, glazed over eyes. Like there's so many ways that the body will indicate when someone's going into an activation cycle in their system. Um, and then we attend from there. So the training and then the practice within the training, because part of the training is we have to do our own sessions and then we get consultation sessions and we do the learning, and it's a whole it's an integrative process of training. It's really like learning our own nervous system because a lot of the information can be felt in our own nervous systems. Our nervous systems communicate with each other. So if I'm feeling something in my nervous system, often I'll check it out with a client and say, like, I'm noticing this thing does that relate to you at all right now while we're kind of sitting with this? And sometimes it's a no and sometimes it's a yes, but there's a bunch of different ways that this information shows up. But I really, really trust the nervous system. It's it's very helpful in showing us what's going on through these things that we learned how to notice over time in training and doing my own work.
Mhm. And so would you be someone that's very aware in your practice of like transference and countertransference?
Oh yeah, that's a thing. I mean, as therapists, that's a thing that we're always holding and looking at and dealing with. But when it comes to working with the nervous system, it's just a different way of experiencing that. Um, Nervous systems have a way of communicating with each other. Like people talk about going into a room and being able to pick up on the energy of a room, and this is information that we're getting via the nervous system. So it's really important as a practitioner, I believe, to really know our own systems so we can tell what's mine, what's not mine. It's really easy when you don't have that sort of sense of boundary
Mhm.
to, kind of merge with something that's happening in someone else's system, especially with survival physiology. It's like nuclear powered life energy. It's so compelling and loud and demanding because it's meant to keep us alive.
Uh-huh.
It's like run out of the burning building, lift the car off the child. Like it's that level of energy. So when you're in the presence of that, to be able to stay in your own container and hold your own experience, it's a skill that really needs to be developed over time in order to support and attune with people who have these
Mhm.
these experiences that need to move without merging with them and then just being unhelpful because kind of two people in the quicksand trying to get out isn't
Absolutely.
isn't super helpful.
Yeah. And so I'll just give a couple examples of what we're kind of speaking to as well is this idea that in a really relaxed way to describe it, it's almost like when you go into a room and you feel the vibe. You feel people's energy.
Yeah.
Like, have you ever like, I'm sure we've all gone into a room and we felt like, "Oh, this is a bit of an awkward social encounter," and we feel that. And so as therapists, I think that's something that we're all trained to do as well, is to be noticing how we feel and noticing our own regulation, because I always jokingly tell clients, I'm like, "If you're escalating in your emotions, it's not helpful if I panic with you. I
Yeah.
have to retain, a sense of calm." And the
Yeah.
reason we use like transference and countertransference is like we don't want to transfer our emotions to the client. And we also don't want to pick up what the client's feeling and take that away with us and then put it even back on them again.
That's
And
it. Yeah.
and I actually think like I recently had an experience of countertransference is one of my clients had a lot of somatic throat closing experience with intense anxiety. And
Right.
then later that day or even the next day, I was like, my throat's sore, but I'm not sick. Like I don't have a cold or anything. But then I was like, oh, am I taking on some of that stress from my client because of their intense throat experience with their anxiety? And I realized I needed to do a little bit more of my own independent regulation, and it kind of passed and I didn't end
Nice.
up getting sick or anything. But it's kind of
Yeah.
interesting that because I was so invested and like wanting to help this client in their experience, I walked away with that. And
Yeah.
so that's why I kind of wanted to bring up that question is around within the realm of somatic experiencing to kind of really define what is somatic. It's the body feelings, it's the sensations, it's the movements, the anything that our body is producing, because every emotion we have allows us to have a body sensation. And even though we may be articulating and communicating something verbally, our body is doing that too as well. We might be aware of it or we might not be aware.
That's right. Yeah. And one of the main ways of noticing that we use in somatic experiencing is sensation. The language of sensation is the language of the nervous system. So that's the go-to. Um, and lots of people don't have access to that right away. So we work with imagery or behavior, like little movements in the body or affect, emotion. But sensation seems to be one of the clearest ways that we can really track and support what wants to complete through the system. And, I think it's just a given. Like if you're human, you're going to get lost a little bit in the interaction sometimes. And then it's having access to that reversibility of like, how can we tell when we're in a little too far and how do we pull ourselves back? And then how do we regulate? How do we access our own sense of regulation itself? Like, because I believe it's impossible to just kind of stay in your own little tube of container if you're wanting to engage with people and especially relate to and help them and create a sense of safety. There's got to be some relatability. So it's really knowing ourselves and our own systems is a huge piece of that, and then being able to come back when we realize we've gone away.
When you cook something or bake something, And at the beginning, you may use a recipe. So you're reading, you're digesting information, and you're putting into practice. But over time, it just becomes like second nature to bake that muffin in that specific way. Like I can make a banana chocolate chip muffin so quickly, and I know exactly what temperature it is. And I don't even have to put a timer on because I've been making them since I was 7 years old.
Right.
But it's because I have that energy, or now it's like alert sense. It's almost automatic. It's almost like muscle memory for me.
Yeah.
Is that what you're kind of meaning in terms of the way that somatic experiencing is taught? It's more from the body instead of like a cognitive sense?
Yeah, that's exactly what I mean. And what I experienced, I grew up like in a family of, my dad was an educator, and um, my mom worked in the school system, and I was always sitting at the front of the class, took lots of notes, very cognitive, very left brained. Um, and when I did this training, it was sort of my first experience of learning in this different way. And for quite a while, I was in a bit of a survival response, just doing the learning this way because it was challenging my old patterns. I wanted to know, and I wanted to understand, and I wanted to be able to explain. And I couldn't find that right away because we were taking the learning in through our experience and then kind of topping up with the cognitive piece. Um, and now I feel like for me, it's the only way. It's actually the way I learn best. And I just didn't know that when I was young. There was so much efforting in the old way of learning. And I mean, we know today that the way that like there's so many different ways that people learn. There's not just one way. So yeah, I think it can be challenging for people, especially new clients who have a lot of stories about what things mean for themselves, to come into this work and then get to know their bodies and get to know and be able to listen to what their bodies are telling them, because the mind has been in charge for a long time, and there's a reason that we do that. It's because it works and it helps, and we figured out a way to kind of make sense of what's happening inside us and around us. So we have to be really gentle with this work, inviting people to notice themselves differently, and be invited to perhaps effort less and use the full resource of the physiology that we're living in, because it's actually a massive, massive resource to us. And oftentimes we're not using a lot of it. And a lot of times, people don't recognize they have anything from like the head down.
Mm-hmm.
So bringing that on board, it can be a challenge and a gift at the same time.
Mm-hmm. So, what would be some somatic experiencing exercises or things that could happen in that type of therapy?
That's a good question. And
I'm
it's
just so
so
curious.
broad. Yeah, it's so broad. So the way that I work, and I tend to work cautiously with people because I myself have a very sensitive nervous system, and I'm not interested in being overwhelmed. And so I'm not interested in taking other people to that place. Sometimes it's going to happen because there's so much on board in the system that we're just going to go there. We're going to have to like negotiate and figure out how to figure out where the edges are. But a lot of times it really starts with orienting towards what's okay, what's less bad. Is there anything going on right now, inside or outside, that isn't overwhelming? If people come to see me right now, I'm not working in person, I'm only working online. But if we start a session and everything is up here, our work is, and I'm lifting my hand above my head for people who are listening, but if people are quite activated, then our work is going to be to support the system to find a way to move towards regulation more. And then how do we feed the pattern of regulation? And it's going to be about paying attention to what's available. Can we notice how our chair is supporting our body right now? And what does that feel like? And is there any part of that that feels neutral or comfortable? And then feeling that with the felt sense and seeing what happens with the body. I said a few times through this last module of assisting that I did, and I say this to my clients all the time, I feel like a big piece of the work is boundaries with our attention. Because when we've got trauma physiology running in the system, it's impossible unless we've done the work of, maybe through meditation or some other practice, it can feel really impossible to not notice the thing that hurts, the thing that feels like it's yelling at us from the inside, like the thing that maybe is an old injury. Um, it's really compelling, and our attention is going to go there because we want to fix it. We want to make it go away. We want to stop hurting. And part of building resource in a system that has trauma physiology is noticing what else is true. There's always more than one thing that's true. But because we've been orienting towards the thing that's screaming at us, there's a lot of parts of us that may not know that. And so we have to build that muscle, if you will, of paying attention to where things aren't as loud, where things aren't as painful, and helping the nervous system create some wiggle room instead of just orienting towards the big loud thing that feels like it's trying to get all our attention.
Hmm. I'm going to try and contextualize it a little bit because as you're thinking, I think of clients or how they present in session and things like that. So if I see someone that's experienced a lot of hardship or trauma or hurtful or too much of an experience and they come to see me, they may have a really hard time feeling their feelings, for example, their emotional feelings. And when we say emotional feelings, it also, again, is accompanied by a physical sensation, right? So when you speak to me about this, it makes me think like, being, like you say, developing that awareness muscle of being able to notice what feels okay for someone and what doesn't, and maybe learning how to mitigate or moderate the feelings that are uncomfortable.
Yeah, that's right. And, there might not be anything that feels okay. There might not be anything that feels neutral. So then we're looking for something that feels less bad.
Mhm.
What's less screamy. And that can also be quite activating for people because when there's that level of activation in the system, trying to find something that's not that can just feel like another demand on the system. And that lets us know, our capacity is full. Um, one of my instructors talks about the nervous system is viewed like a container, and it's not about having too much energy in the container, life energy. It's about the capacity of the container to hold the energy. We want to have as much access to as much life energy as we possibly can. But if our container is squinched, then we really need to work to give the nervous system more room so that that energy can have more fluidity. And I keep coming back to that because what I notice is people come in and their containers are full and they want to get rid of that experience. And it's not so much about that. It's about that experience needs to reintegrate so that it can actually be used on our behalf. That energy is wanting to mobilize so that it can make space and we can actually have access to our life energy so that we can enjoy life and be creative and have good relationships and get good productive rest and have good digestion and cell repair and all these things. Our autonomic nervous system, governs regulation. And if we don't have access to consistent regulation, there's going to be problems.
Mhm. Yeah. So when I try and think about that, I know what you mean. A lot of people are like, "Oh, I want that bad experience just to go away." And so the way that you're expressing it and the way I'm understanding it is you're trying to make more space for it and not it be seen such in a negative light, but be able to utilize that as a helpful thing for their life or utilize the energy from that experience in a more neutral or positive way. And just again, making more room for it.
Well, yeah, we have to make room in order to attend to it. Now, this isn't 100% of the time. Sometimes there can be so much going on that we have to go to one of the loud, screamy things and just let that incomplete response in the nervous system complete. It depends on how much capacity is in the nervous system already. But ideally, we can build a little more resource in the system so people have a different experience of themselves and have more access to something that's not this thing that has been demanding their attention and all their energy so that we can come from that place of resource and then attend to the overwhelm from there. And then in small digestible bits, we can move that trauma physiology through the system instead of, doing it all at once or in big chunks, because that's just going to re-traumatize the nervous system. So it's really there's a big piece in this work about titration, which is a scientific term, like Science 9. I don't know if you ever did like chemistry, where you take like a little bit of one substance and then put it in another. So it's the same with doing this work. We really want to have a nice access to resource in the system. However, we're going to find that. And then from this resource, we titrate with the trauma physiology from there. Because what we pay attention to, we're feeding. And so if there is this loud, demanding sort of experience in the body that, creates panic attacks or anxiety, or we can't sleep, or we have digestion issues, or we have body pain, it's really, really difficult and near impossible to just not notice that if it's with us all the time. We have to find a way to have a different experience so that we can attend to this thing without it taking over. And that's a big piece of the early work when people come to see me often, unless they've had like a pretty good life with not much upheaval or interruption, or they've gotten lots of good support, so they've moved through things, and then they have like one event that kind of really got stored in the system, that we're going to be able to attend to it and really just kind of work with that experience in the system rather than building up this massive resource, because they've already got quite a bit on board. So it's very individual.
Would you be able to demonstrate or show like a somatic experiencing exercise?
We can do a little back and forth about the way that I work, but
Sure.
it's not necessarily going to be like an SE, like a textbook SE
Sure.
thing.
Yeah. And we will, disclaimer, grain of salt, this is an example and does not encompass all of somatic experiencing. But I think it would just be interesting for people listening or people who watch this on YouTube to kind of know what that might look like, just at least a little bit.
Yeah. Okay. So I would invite you to notice in this moment, just as we've been talking about all of this, if you take a moment and feel from the inside, what are some of the things that get your attention right now?
I noticed that I'm a little bit sore in my shoulder blades and neck area because I've been sitting at the computer for a little while today so far, and that has a little bit of tension. I notice also that my hands are a little cold because I don't have the heat on in this room. What else am I noticing? I notice a little bit of pressure in the front of my head because I'm thinking as I try and be present with here with you.
Right. Yeah, fair enough.
I notice that I've had to shift crossing my legs back and forth a couple of times as I lose blood flow in different legs, like goes a little bit to sleep. Um, but emotionally, I feel pretty at ease, I would say.
Mm. So I'm curious, out of all those things that you mentioned, how do you notice that emotional ease?
I think where I look to a lot is in my chest and abdomen and stomach in terms of the sensations that I may feel. So I feel that pressure in my shoulders, but that's just, I think, I don't necessarily notice it as stress emotionally. I notice it more stress on the body from maybe not having the best posture today. But I know that I'm at ease because I can generally find that if I'm in discomfort, it shows up more in my abdomen or my chest, my stomach area.
And that's not happening right now.
Yes. So there's an absence of it.
There's an absence of it, right? And so how would you describe what is going on in your chest? If you could have, this is something that one of my practitioners has used quite a bit. If you could have your fingers inside there, feeling inside the chest, how would you describe what it feels like in there right now?
Um, I think it would just feel solid, smooth, contained.
Contained. Okay. So would it be okay for us to just hang out for a few moments while you let yourself feel that quality of solid and smooth and contained from the inside?
Sure.
And as you feel that, if it changes or if something else tries to get your attention, let me know. Otherwise, we're just going to hang out and feel that for a few moments.
I think I just start to see images. So I see like images of like firm concrete, but like sun shining on it. I know that seems silly, but that's like
No.
it's a positive firmness.
Yep.
That grabs my awareness because sometimes when I think I see images.
Yeah. Images is one of the ways that we process in this work. Absolutely. I'm a big image person myself, so I get it.
Yeah. As I sit with that feeling, It feels contained, like it feels like the width of my chest, and that's why it feels contained. It doesn't feel like it's expansive and going on forever. It just feels like the size or the diameter of my chest.
Right. Okay. And do you feel like it goes in deeper into your body than just the surface? Does it go like all the way back to your spine, or does it kind of stay above your rib cage?
I think it goes all the way to the back of my spine from like, yeah, the front to the back, and then it kind of ends against the chair.
Okay, all the way through then.
Mhm.
Mhm. And is there any place in that particular area where you feel that feels the nicest to notice, or does it kind of all feel the same and it's all feeling contained and smooth?
Feels pretty balanced throughout.
So even as we're talking about it, is there anything that you notice happening while we're paying attention to that? Is there anything else that's getting your attention?
I think actually, like I can notice more of a sensation in my legs, feel a little bit more at ease, even though it's a small shift. If I were to be really picky about it.
Yeah, yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. So if we were to go on, I mean, we can if you want to,
No, yeah.
but if we were to go on, because of how we're orienting our attention towards the thing that feels, not like the places that we're kind of giving you some different information about maybe some pain or discomfort, your body may continue to demonstrate shifts like that happened in your legs.
Mhm.
Um, my intention was for us to orient towards more resource instead of kind of going to the things that we're feeling loud just because of what we're doing here and the time
Mhm.
that we have available. But even that small shift that you notice in your legs, and like as somebody who does this work, I'm guessing that you have quite a bit of self-awareness, so you're able to catch that. Not everybody will, and some people will.
Mhm.
But as we continue to orient towards things that feel, less bad or maybe even pleasant,
Mhm.
the body is going to keep demonstrating experiences of that, and or the trauma pattern is going to show up and say, "Oh, she's paying attention.
Mhm.
Listen to me. Look over here. Maybe the shoulders would have gotten a little bit louder or something else." And then we would titrate with that.
Okay. That was very helpful because now I have a better understanding of that. And when I think about my EMDR practice too, as well, when I facilitate that with clients, a lot of our preparatory stages before the bilateral stimulation is noticing our feelings, how it feels in the body, being able to sit with that, be present with that. Because as we do our reprocessing, we want to notice again, like the shifts in the body that are happening. And it's actually really interesting because in a processing session as well, I do notice shifts in their body language. Sometimes I even notice that they start facilitating bilateral themselves, like a right left movement of their feet, for example, or their legs, even though they're just engaging in a visual sense as well. But that was really interesting because, as you probably noticed, and I mentioned earlier, a lot of clients do really struggle or individual struggles sitting in their body and noticing what they're feeling.
Yeah.
Right. And so for me, I think in a visual sense as well. And that's why it was so helpful for this demonstration because I have a window behind me as well. And I actually just noticed that the snowflakes are slowly falling and like that kind of stuff. And so I've gotten better at attuning to my body, but that was a really, again, a helpful exercise in that way. Um, but that makes sense because you're giving the opportunity for them to feel their whole body and how that shifts and changes just as we attune and become aware to it.
Yeah, that's right. And like I said before, sometimes people can't access that information. Sometimes there's so much stored experience that is unpleasant that we're really looking for like what's less bad, and then kind of tuning into how we can make some wiggle room from there. And sometimes we orient visually, sometimes using the ears, sometimes it's bringing up an image of something that was maybe pleasant at some time in life. Um, Sometimes it feels like we're grasping for straws, but there is always something that's less terrible. We just have to find it. Yeah.
Yeah, because it was interesting because, like, even as you describe them, like, it feels like smooth concrete, but it feels like the sun shining, which almost makes me think of, like, a sports court or something, and I've always enjoyed sports. So now as you
Oh,
say, it's like, oh, maybe it was pulling that information and that memory in as I thought about those body sensations.
yeah.
And they're just I also wanna say for anyone that's listening or listens to this example, from my experience of this as you guided it through, they're just like blips and doesn't necessarily wasn't like a full expansive whole movie memory, but it's just like a just kind of a little spark of something that comes up.
That's it. And that is often how it happens. It's little blips and sparks. And sometimes we miss them. In fact, I think when we're in our day to day, we miss them a lot. But paying attention to them, especially in like a contained environment where we're actually orienting towards that and slowing things down so we can find those things, we're going to have more access to them in our day to day because we're laying it down in the blueprint differently, if that makes sense, by giving it that time and space, asking about how we notice it in the body, allowing that experience to just take up more room, because orienting to pleasure and to our resources on the inside and outside is a really big way that we support ourselves and prepare ourselves for not just working with our histories, but also just doing life.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And so this might be a biased question, but who would you encourage to pursue somatic experiencing? Like, what individuals would you say, yeah, maybe this is like a good thing to pursue?
That's such a good question. I remember having a conversation with my supervisor about this, and she said it's not for everybody. Um, and I was really deep in the soup at that point. I was like, oh, that's good to know, because when you find something that really works for you, which I felt like it was that for me, I was thinking everybody needs to do this, and that's not the case. So, at the risk of sounding a little flaky, I would say people who, when they hear about it or have information that lands with them about it and they feel drawn to it, those are the people that I think should maybe pursue it a little bit. Also, it can be helpful. I'll maybe broaden it a little bit. People with early developmental trauma, it can be really helpful with people with sports injuries, people who've had extensive um, dental work, people with um, like long-standing health issues. Often autonomic system regulation can be at the root of that. Um, it can be helpful. Yeah, go ahead.
What about chronic pain?
Yeah, that was what I was thinking of when I was talking about the histories of health issues. A lot of people with chronic pain have come through my practice, and there's an element of this work that involves touch. It's a sort of we touched on touch at the end of the training in the advanced modules, and then there's a specific touch training for trauma therapists that people can take after the somatic experiencing training, because often with chronic pain there's inflammation, and that can come from a number of life experiences. And I worked with clients without doing touch with chronic pain, and I find using the touch work with chronic pain can be, I'd say, it feels like it's more productive to do it that way. Not always, but most of the time that's felt more productive. So it's the same principles, but it's using touch with which, therapeutically, there's a whole bunch of different implications with that. Lots of consent stuff needs to be sorted out and that kind of thing. But lifting the inflammation, supporting the inflammation to lift off of the system is going to be really, really productive, because people often who have chronic pain are doing a lot of other modalities to try and get relief. And if the trauma physiology is looping in the system, their body's not going to be able to take up and metabolize the other good work that they're doing, because the trauma is kind of blocking that from being able to be really productive. That's not always the case, but sometimes, yeah.
Because so often, like even within EMDR or trauma work that I do, there is a reduction in physical pain as that trauma is processed or let go or seen differently. It's really kind of interesting how that holds. And that really, again, speaks to this idea that the body holds all of that. It holds that it's stuck in those autonomic reserve response cycles of like fight, flight, freeze, those sorts of
Yeah. Bracing patterns and
things.
yeah, which all of those things were really productive and helped us to get through. And then they're unsustainable on the other end after a while. Yeah.
No,
Take a lot
for
of
sure.
energy.
Yeah, interesting.
Really.
Is there anything that we've missed today that maybe you would want to share or express around your practice or somatic experiencing?
I mean, there's so much more we could talk about, really. Um, yeah. I can't think of anything off the top of my head. Most of the people who I see have either heard about this work or they've got word of mouth from somebody who's done this work and have told them how it's helpful. Um, I think, as we're coming into more, can I say, post-COVID, people who've had, a lot of overwhelming experiences, there's been so much that people are learning about themselves and learning collectively and dealing with. I am a huge fan of talk therapy. I did talk therapy myself for a number of years before I even started doing sort of more body focused modalities just as a client myself. And I think incorporating the whole person in therapeutic work right now is really, really, really important because we need access to as much of ourselves as we can possibly have to keep moving forward. So, yeah, I mean, honestly, Haley, there's so much more I could say, but I'm not really sure which rabbit trails to go down. So maybe I'll just leave it at that.
Sure, definitely. And I agree with your sentiment regarding that talk therapy can sometimes really just exist in the mind, which again is not a bad thing. But I
No,
like your point around encompassing the whole
mhm,
body, the whole mind, because the body isn't just the head, it's the everything else that's attached.
that's right. That's exactly right. Yeah.
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 Well, I appreciate so much your time for joining us today. It was really interesting, and I appreciate you being so open and eager to do the little demonstration with me. Um, yeah, so thank you again for coming on and sharing all of your knowledge.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. It was lovely.